Your address, what?
The fire just kept going. They couldn't do anything.
They just kept praying. Please let her be okay. Please let her be okay.
They just said it could be an accident. She could have died in the fire. We don't know.
I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't. I just didn't want it to be true.
It was confirmed that it was in fact a homicide.
Where does David say he was during the time of the fire?
At the hockey rink with his boys.
On the evening of September 14th, 2014, the peaceful neighborhood of Pickering, Ontario, was jolted by the sight of a raging fire. Neighbors watched helplessly as thick black smoke billowed from the Knight family home, engulfing it in flames. The fire department arrived quickly, but when they finally doused the flames, what they found inside was anything but ordinary. Carmela Knight, a beloved mother and wife, was dead. But this wasn't just another tragic fire. The clues left behind would soon reveal a dark and twisted mystery, one that would leave everyone questioning who could have done such a thing. Before we continue with this shocking story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future true crime stories. If you're as intrigued by this mystery as we are, leave a comment below with your thoughts on what could have happened. Now, let's unravel this chilling case. Carmela Knight was the kind of person who made life brighter just by being in it. She was a devoted mother, fiercely protective of her 2 young boys, and a loving wife. Everyone who met her quickly saw what a gem she was. She was the kind of woman who made sure to attend every hockey game, cheering from the sidelines with boundless energy even when life got busy. Her days were a blur of carpooling, school events, and work, but she never let her family feel neglected. Neighbors and friends all agreed Carmela was one of the good ones. She was a sweetheart. No one had a bad word to say about her. One friend said, her voice tinged with disbelief as she spoke about Carmela's shocking death. She'd do anything for anyone. That's just who she was. But behind the smiles and the friendly chatter, there were cracks in Carmela's life, cracks no one expected would eventually shatter her family's world. For months, whispers had swirled about tension between Carmela and her husband, David Knight. The couple had been facing problems, and those problems were only getting worse. Still, Carmela remained focused on her children, always putting them first, and she continued to put on a brave face for those who didn't know better. But deep down, something had changed. Her friends noticed it. The way her laughter no longer reached her eyes, how her warm smile didn't seem as bright. But no one could have predicted the nightmare that was about to unfold. When the fire erupted in the Knight family home that evening, everyone feared the worst, but no one could have imagined just how deep the tragedy went. Carmela wasn't just caught in the flames. She was at the center of a web of secrets and lies, a story that no one could have foreseen, not even those closest to her. As the fire trucks arrived and the flames roared, firefighters scrambled to contain the inferno. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, was now consumed by smoke and fire. Once the flames were extinguished, the damage was clear, but what the investigators found inside the charred remains of the home would leave them stunned. The fire had started in the garage, where Carmela's body was discovered, but what seemed like a tragic accident soon revealed itself as something much more sinister. Carmela's body wasn't simply burned. Her injuries were far too specific to be the result of the fire alone. Investigators were perplexed when they found a tourniquet tightly wrapped around her arm, and worse, a needle still stuck in her skin. But here's the thing, Carmela had never used drugs. Friends and family knew she had no history of substance abuse. The discovery didn't make sense, and the mystery deepened when the autopsy results came back. The medical examiner confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Carmela had been murdered before the fire even started. She had been violently attacked, her life taken with brutal force. She had suffered facial injuries, and most disturbingly, the cause of death was blunt force trauma followed by neck compression. There was no sign that Carmela had even seen her attacker coming. Detective Diane Jennings, who had seen many disturbing cases in her time, was shaken by the discovery. There was nothing about Carmela's life that suggested she'd be the victim of such a brutal crime. No one could believe it. She was loved by everyone, but the deeper they dug, the more questions arose. The fire was no accident. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it look like one. As investigators combed through the scene, the reality of the crime began to settle in. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was calculated. Carmela's life had been deliberately taken, and someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. But who? And why? Detective Diane Jennings was determined to find answers. Carmela's family and friends were left in shock, each one struggling to make sense of the murder. How could someone who was so well-loved by everyone she knew end up a victim of such violence? The more the detective and her team looked into Carmela's life, the more they realized the killer might have been closer than they had ever imagined. The first place they turned to was Carmela's husband, David Knight. David had a solid alibi. He was on the ice at hockey practice when the fire broke out. Surveillance footage confirmed it, but that wasn't enough to rule him out. In fact, David's alibi raised even more questions. While he was away, someone had triggered the home's security alarm, but it wasn't David who had caused it. Someone had entered the house while he was gone. Could it have been someone laying in wait? Someone who knew Carmela's schedule? As the investigation unfolded, Carmela's mother, Franca Agosta, revealed a strange encounter. A man had approached her daughter while she was working in the backyard not long before the murder. He was driving a black SUV and asked for David. When Carmela said he wasn't home, the man had simply left, but Carmela's reaction had unsettled her mother. She was scared. Franca told investigators, "I could tell something wasn't right." She didn't know who he was. Could this mysterious man be connected to the crime? Or was there something else going on? The detectives' team was now looking at more than just a grieving husband. They began to consider the possibility that the killer might have been someone closer to the family. Could someone in David's circle be responsible? The tension was rising. Every person in Carmela's life now seemed a potential suspect. The investigation had just begun, but it was already clear nothing about this case would be simple. As the investigation deepened, the Knight family's secrets began to surface, and they painted a far more complicated picture than anyone had anticipated. Carmela and David's marriage had been anything but perfect. In fact, it had been unraveling for months. Detective Jennings quickly discovered that Carmela had caught David in a betrayal that shattered their family. David had been having an affair with a woman in Florida, a fact Carmela had discovered after finding compromising photos on a thumb drive hidden in David's car. The photos were damning, naked pictures of the woman and a photo of David with his arm around her, kissing her on the cheek. She was devastated. Carmela's sister, Nancy Borage, recalled, "Carmela wasn't the type to go through his things, but when she found those photos, it all clicked. The trust was gone." Carmela confronted David about the affair, and though he promised to end it and sought counseling, things didn't improve. Carmela had reached a breaking point, deciding she could no longer live with his lies. David begged her to stay, Nancy continued, but she said no. She couldn't do it anymore. The marriage was effectively over and Carmela had filed for divorce. But even as the couple was headed for separation, David's financial situation had worsened. He had stopped paying their mortgage, and the family's once comfortable life was now teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Now, investigators began to see a clearer motive. David stood to gain a large life insurance payout, $800,000 in the event of Carmela's death. Could that be enough to push him over the edge? Had he become desperate enough to take her life? Yet, something still didn't sit right. Detective Jennings and her team were beginning to wonder if David had acted alone. Something about the whole situation felt off. They needed more to go on, and that's when another unsettling detail emerged. Carmela, in the midst of everything, had filed an emergency motion for custody of her children. The hearing was scheduled for just 3 days after her death. Was this too much for David to handle? Could he have seen the upcoming custody battle as a threat? Something that pushed him to take the unthinkable step of orchestrating his wife's murder? The The pieces were slowly starting to fall into place, but the detective still wasn't sure if David was the mastermind behind it all. It was time to dig deeper. Time to look at other people in Carmela's life, people who might have had something to gain. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that David Knight wasn't the only one with secrets. Another troubling lead emerged: Carmela's brother-in-law, Matt Knight. Just days after the murder, Matt's behavior raised a red flag. He fled to Florida, abandoning his home and leaving behind his house keys as if he had no intention of returning. But it wasn't just his sudden departure that caught the attention of investigators. It was the strange phone call he made to his wife before he left. He just said, "I know who, what, when, where, and how. With a phone call, I could have stopped this, and I have to live with it for the rest of my life," Heather Knight, Matt's wife, told investigators. She recalled her husband bursting into tears after the call. He said, "Maybe 20-30 years down the road, when we're on a beach somewhere or something, I'll fill you in on everything. But I don't want to tell you everything because I don't want you to be in that position." That conversation haunted Heather. Why would Matt say such things? And why was he acting so strangely? Could he have known something? Or perhaps he had played a role in the murder? The investigation team decided to track down Matt, flying to Florida to confront him. But when they arrived, Matt insisted that his wife was lying about the phone call and refused to cooperate with the authorities. His reluctance to talk raised even more suspicion. What was he hiding? And why was he so defensive? There was another piece to the puzzle. Graham McDonald, a contractor who had been working at the Knight home, also came under suspicion. He had been in contact with Matt around the time of the fire. When police spoke to McDonald, he claimed he had no involvement in Carmela's death, stating he had gone to visit his grandmother and took the train home from Toronto that night. But the evidence didn't line up. Surveillance footage contradicted his alibi, and when investigators pressed him further, McDonald's story started to unravel. In a second interview, McDonald confessed something shocking. He admitted to smoking crack on the night of the murder but couldn't recall exactly where he had been. The police were now faced with a key suspect who wasn't helping them get any closer to the truth. As the investigation widened, new details emerged about the strained relationship between Carmela and David. A year and a half earlier, Carmela had caught David having an affair. She had found pictures on his phone, images that revealed the affair in no uncertain terms. Even though David promised to end the relationship, the damage had been done. Carmela knew that he was still seeing his mistress, and she decided enough was enough. Their marriage had reached its breaking point. The discovery of this affair wasn't just a betrayal. It was a catalyst for what was to come. Carmela filed for divorce and planned to fight for custody of her children. The timing couldn't have been worse. As the family's financial situation worsened, David was faced with the possibility of losing everything. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but was David the one who had planned Carmela's murder, or was someone else involved? The case was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would lead investigators to a startling confession. As the investigation grew more complicated, Detective Jennings knew they were close to uncovering the truth, but they needed a break, a piece of the puzzle that could tie everything together. That's when they decided to employ an undercover strategy that would turn the case upside down. McDonald had become a key figure in the investigation. While he was initially able to hide behind lies and confusion, the detectives had something up their sleeves. They sent an undercover officer to befriend him, creating a false bond that would lure McDonald into revealing more than he intended. Through careful planning, they set up a meeting, an unusual one, held in a remote ice fishing hut, far away from prying eyes. When McDonald and his friend arrived, they were greeted by Uncle Dan, another undercover officer who introduced himself as someone with a reputation for helping people in trouble. Someone who could fix problems, no questions asked. The meeting took an unexpected turn when the police stopped the vehicle McDonald was in, letting him know that he was now a suspect in an ongoing murder investigation. The pressure was on. Alone in the hut with nowhere to run, McDonald began to unravel. "I did it," McDonald confessed quietly, his voice shaking with guilt. "I killed her." The confession was chilling. McDonald described how he had been hired to murder Carmela by none other than David Knight. According to MacDonald, David had let him into the house while he was away at hockey practice, and he waited in the bathroom for Carmela's return. When she came home, she didn't expect anyone to be inside. She walked through the garage, unaware that MacDonald was waiting to strike. She came in through the garage, and I attacked her from behind, MacDonald said, his eyes downcast as he relived the moment. She fought for her life, but I got her down on the ground. I strangled her. I had to make sure she was gone. MacDonald went on to explain that he had staged the scene, wrapping a tourniquet around her arm to make it look like an overdose. He had hoped the authorities would believe it was an accidental death. But deep down, MacDonald knew the truth. It wasn't an accident, it was murder, cold and deliberate. With a confession in hand, the police still needed something more to completely tie David to the crime. So, Uncle Dan came up with a plan to push MacDonald into revealing further details. He told MacDonald that a friend with a terminal illness was willing to take the fall for the murder, but only if he knew every detail. MacDonald, desperate to clear his conscience, took the bait. He told Uncle Dan about the payment. David had promised him $100,000 for the job, and the plan was to start a new life in Florida. But the money never came. MacDonald had received nothing but false promises. To make sure David was involved, undercover officers convinced MacDonald to demand some of the money he was promised. When David agreed to meet him and hand over $5,000 in cash, the final piece of evidence fell into place. The police had everything they needed. With MacDonald's confession in hand, Detective Jennings and her team had what they needed to move forward. The confession, coupled with the undercover sting involving the $5,000 payment, finally gave them enough evidence to arrest David Knight and Graham MacDonald. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still an overwhelming sense of disbelief in the air. How could a man who had been married to Carmela, the mother of his children, turn so violently against her? David Knight was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and arson. His life, which had once been filled with promises of a fresh start in Florida and financial gain, now crumbled before him. David's betrayal was unimaginable. For months, he had lived a double life, pretending to care for his family while plotting the brutal death of his wife for a life insurance payout and freedom from a crumbling marriage. MacDonald, who had carried out the murder at David's bidding, was also arrested and charged. Both men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The justice that Carmela's family had desperately hoped for was finally served, but it came at a cost that would never be forgotten. As Carmela's family tried to come to terms with the loss, her mother, Franca Agosta, struggled to find peace. "I want him to suffer," she said, speaking of David. "Every day. I want him to think about what he did, how he destroyed a family, how he took my daughter from me." Franca's grief was raw, and the pain of losing her daughter was unbearable. But even more heart-wrenching was the impact on Carmela's children. Dylan, the youngest son, had to face the unthinkable truth. His father was responsible for his mother's murder. He had spent his entire life trusting David, only to realize that the man he had called a hero was the one who had shattered their world. "I didn't want to believe it," Dylan admitted, his voice filled with sorrow. "But I had to. I had to face it. And it's hard." Dylan moved in with his aunt Nancy Borage as he tried to rebuild his life after the tragedy. The bond between mother and son, once so strong, had been torn apart forever. The boy's innocence was lost, and his childhood was stolen in a way no one could ever repair. Carmela Knight's death left an irreplaceable hole in the hearts of those who loved her. She was not just a mother and wife, she was a friend, a confidant, and a beacon of light for everyone around her. Her family and friends were left reeling from the shock of her violent death. The thought that someone so full of life could be taken so brutally, and by someone she had trusted, was almost too much to bear. Her mother, Franca Agosta, would never recover from the loss of her daughter. The pain was constant, a deep ache that never faded. "She was my baby," Franca said, her voice trembling. "I had to bury her. How do you do that? How do you live with the fact that your daughter is gone because of a man she loved?" For Carmela's friends, it was no easier. The woman they had known for so long, always smiling, always kind, was gone. And what made it even harder to accept was the fact that her death had been planned by the very person who was supposed to love and protect her. The betrayal was unforgivable and the sorrow immeasurable. But perhaps the hardest reality to face was the impact on Carmela's children. Dylan especially had to come to terms with the fact that his own father was responsible for his mother's death. "I don't know if I'll ever get over it," Dylan admitted. "I lost everything that day." For the rest of his life, Dylan would carry the weight of knowing that his father had stolen his childhood from him. He would grow up knowing that the man who had been his hero had not only taken his mother from him, but had also shattered their family. The scars from that betrayal would never fully heal, and yet, despite everything, the family tried to move forward. Carmela's sister, Nancy Borage, took Dylan in, and they tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. It wasn't easy, but they were determined to keep Carmela's memory alive. The questions lingered. How had this all happened? How could anyone resort to murder for money, for freedom, for selfish gain? The story of Carmela Knight served as a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The man who claimed to love her, who promised to be there for her, was the one who destroyed her life. The real tragedy wasn't just the murder, it was the fact that a family was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, haunted by the betrayal of the one person they should have been able to trust the most. What do you think drove David Knight to commit such a terrible crime? Could there ever be a justification for betraying the ones we love most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories. Share this video with your friends, and stay tuned for our next investigation into the darkest corners of human nature.